Should we get started or should we be waiting for something?
You are all set whenever you're ready.
Okay, let's get started then. Thanks everyone for joining us in this Birds of a Feather session. So we had one of these last year, and the working group basically asked you guys questions more than presented any solutions. So we wanted to come back this year and show you what we've been working on in response to what we learned from last year. So I'll go through this presentation first, and then we can have Q&A at the end. It's a pretty short presentation, 15 slides, I think. So I'm thinking the best format is to just go through the whole I'm sorry, is there a question? Okay, so I'm thinking the best thing here would be to go through the presentation as is, and then when the questions come up, I can easily flip back to various slides. So I think rather than have questions during the slides, it probably makes sense just to have them at the end. But I don't want anybody to be forgetting their questions. I'm not trying to avoid any questions. I just think it might be good to see the whole thing first. All right, so this is, of course, the Birds of a Feather 2022. Let me work out how I can get this to advance. There we go. Okay, so our takeaways from last year's session. So we can certainly see that the majority of users have not updated to a library release that conforms to the IEEE 18.2 standard for UVM. And that's disappointing, of course, for those of us who are working on the new releases, because we're trying to put useful fixes for people in there, and if they're not getting it, it's not useful at all. The primary reason was backward incompatibility. It was just too difficult to take existing code and make it work with later versions, and keep your projects going. So that I can understand. It's going to take some time out, and people are busy and they're doing project related stuff. So that we can see is the big hurdle. A secondary reason seemed to be that there, at least for some people, may not be a strong motivation to update. So we had the hurdle there. If the motivation was strong enough, people would probably say, yeah, I'll take a week out, 2 weeks out, whatever, because the new release is just that good. But we didn't have that strong pull either. So we're trying to address both of those, mostly that primary reason, they lower the hurdle, but we continue to try and work on giving strong reasons to update, and we'll present that here. All right, so backward compatibility, what are we going to do about it? The main thing is that we are changing our whole philosophy on what to do when API is no longer recommended. So certainly when you're developing software, you're going to have times when you look back at old API and think, gosh, that really didn't do the job very well. We'd like to introduce new API that replaces that and does it better. And we'd like to have people not use the old API because the new one's better. So we used to go through and say, we're going to deprecate things, and we'd mark them as deprecation, and you could only get them if you set a define to say, I want the deprecated API. And eventually we would remove it because as a development group, we didn't really want to keep supporting the old API. But that, of course, led to the problem that people cannot migrate. So our new philosophy is to go ahead and keep all the old functionality. We're not going to document it anymore. You'd have to go back to the old documentation for the release that you got it from to see what it did, but it's not going to be gone. It will keep working the way it used to work. And there won't be any compiling problem or runtime problem with using this old functionality. It will just be it'll just be available other better API, which we will document. And if people are starting from scratch, we hope that they would start with those. Another change of philosophy is to inform people whether they're using a kind of API that we're no longer recommending. So it used to be that the way you'd find out about that is your simulation compile would fail because it would no longer find that API, and that would be your error. Well, that's a very harsh failure because you can't simulate, you can't get your job done. So we're moving that towards making it something that a third-party linter could support. So we are not, we the working group are not providing such a linter, but we are putting tags on the API such that linting tools can recognize those tags and could tell you, hey, your user code is calling these 5 examples of API that are no longer recommended by the working group. And at your leisure, you could decide to change them. But we're not forcing you, and you could still run your simulation, and everything should be much better. So what's going to happen then with the upcoming release, which is going to be called 2020-2.0? Many of the API that have been removed or changed since 1.1D, so we decided to go back to 1.1D, not beyond that. It seemed like most people were at least at 1.1D. Many people are on 1.2, and of course, they'll be covered as well. But that API has been removed or changed. We're going to add it back to the library. So we've been in the process of doing that. And once that library is available, you should be able to compile and run with the existing user code. And even if you write new code that was written for 1800.2, all of that should be able to run together. So if you call new API, if you called old API, everything should work. There will be a few API changes that still require a limited user edit. We will cover those, and we want to get your feelings on those. We don't want the hurdle to be still too high. So I think most of these are going to be viewed as minor, and many of them are rare. But anyway, we'll cover those and get to them. All right, so adding back APIs solves this problem. It'd be nice if we could just add back everything, but we haven't been able to add back everything for a couple of reasons. One is that there's a few instances where the old API and the new API that's documented in the IEEE LRM actually conflict. So if you changed it to the old API, you'd be breaking compatibility with the IEEE, and we haven't decided to do that, or we'd be just making an old version. So an example of this is that UVM sequence base used to be a regular class in 1.2 and before, and it's now an abstract class later on. Well, we have to keep it an abstract class because that conforms to the IEEE. But it does mean that there will be a subtle usage problem if somebody assumes that it's a regular class. Another thing that we don't want to do is reintroduce a bug that was fixed. So we had a number of bugs that came up because of variables being statically initialized and running into a race condition. So we removed that initialization in 1800.2. We don't want to bring it back because the bug would come back, but we do have suggestions for what can be done to get those variables you need set without hitting a static bug, but it could still involve some user code changes. All right, so just to give everyone a feel, like a kind of visual of how well we did on this, we identified 62 issues by a process where we compared the LRM. So we looked at the LRM for 1800.2 and for 1.2 and 1.1D, and identified API that had changed between those two. We came up with 62. Since then, I think we've come up with a few more that we didn't find there, but you get the rough idea. That's the general size of it. And the majority of those we could fix in the library, right? So we've taken variables that we had protected because we've added accessor methods now, and it's much better if people use those. But we've removed the protection so that it can be backward compatible. So people can go through and directly access those variables much the same way they always used to, And linting would be the way to find that and make sure that you weren't corrupting anything you might be doing when you extend your accessors. Similarly, we're adding back the deprecated APIs, so things that have been in libraries before under a tick if def, and then we eventually got rid of them. We're now bringing them back without the tick if def. They're just in there, right? They're there. They're not documented, but they're fully usable. We also found some things were not actually a compatibility issue. We've got an example here. I didn't put enough information on what this example means, but the idea would be that even though APIs actually change in the LRM, it's not always a problem with other usage. If it was not a virtual function and we added a new default value for the arguments, then there's no problem in using it the way you always did. So the remainder of these we can fix with a edit to the user code. And the pie graph over here kind of shows you the proportion of these. So the blue, which is the nice big piece here with things that we fixed, they just came back in the library. The not an issue was the green, so that doesn't affect anybody either. So we're down to this yellow piece of ones that require some user edit. And that may still look a little scary. It's still a noticeable piece of the pie, but many of these, or we hope all of these, are kind of rare conditions that people aren't going to hit into. And the working group's continuing to work on this. And if there's some of these in here that we find we could actually bring back with a bit more effort, we are going to continue to do that. Okay, so let's look in detail at the ones that remain. What are the hurdles that remain? So there's 3 slides here that talk about what you have to do if you're coming from 1.1D. You've got code that ran successfully with 1.1D, not 1.2. If you have code that's based on 1.2, you don't need to worry about these 3. They're not going to be issues for you because these are changes between 1.1D and 1.2. All right, so the first one was that we took transaction events and event pool that used to be publicly accessible in 1.1D, and we put them behind accessors in 1.2. The implementation changes that we've done for 1.2 mean that you can't really have a constant reference to an event. It'll get stale and it'll go bad, so you can no longer continually use these. So if user code is directly referencing the events or the pool, then they're going to have to be updated to use the accessor API. Don't really know how common that is. That's part of what we'd be hoping to find from people as they try this out. Then there's a couple of classes that we used to have as regular classes that became abstract classes. So in general, the issue with becoming an abstract class is that you can't instance it anymore. But also we took the functionality that was in UVM Factory and UVM Report Server, and we put it into a default factory and a default report server implementation. So in this case, what user code is going to have to do, wherever it pointed to UVM Factory and UVM Report Server, it now needs to point to UVM Default Factory and Default Report Server. So if you extended from UVM Report Server before, to get the same things brought over from inheritance, you need to extend from UVM Default Report Server. Okay, we added a default argument to some of the API that was actually virtual. So there's a couple of examples here, one in report object, one in the virtual register. Don't know how common it would be for people to have extended these APIs, but if you did, your extension needs to add the default argument or you won't compile. If you are just calling this API, there's no problem because the default argument will allow you to have no actual for the argument, and it'll just fill in what it needs to make it work, and everything's okay. So we hope this is a rare case. I don't think many people would be extending this API, but I guess we'll find out. This is kind of a big change. The UVM recorder implementation was kind of redone between 1.1D and 1.2. So if you actually have implemented a recorder and you've made use of a lot of this API, all of that is going to need to be redone to use the new API. Could be a bunch of work. It probably will not be in a lot of user code. Like, it's not something you do in tests probably. It's probably something that would be done once in a central location for many test benches to use. If you are just using the recorder, you're just recording transactions, there's no change. The outside API looks the same. It's only if you are implementing what you want to have done when the recorder is doing its work. And the last one for 1.1D, and again, we hope this is rare, is we changed the type of some arguments in a few APIs. So the argument used to have the type logic 63 down to 0. We changed it to be a type def, which is called UVM integral T. And these are some of the APIs that use it. We do define it as logic signed 63 down to 0, so it's compatible completely with what used to be. And so everything's still good from that standpoint. But we do realize that there's a possibility that user code could redefine this type def and extend these methods. And if they did that, it would no longer compile because their redefinition would not be compatible with the logic 63 down to 0 that the user code was expecting. So again, I hope this is extremely rare, but we just wanted to point it out. Okay, so all of that was 1.1D. Again, if you are currently using 1.2, you didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. So here are the ones that apply whether you're coming from 1.1D or 1.2. So the first thing is that we took some package level static variables with some static values assigned to them and put them into accessors. So the reason we were doing that is that the initialization of these global variables led to a static initialization bug. We had race conditions that were just giving wrong values at times. So the kind of variables we're talking about are UVM top, UVM factory, and those now are supposed to be accessed through UVM core service API. And we have some other sort of helper API that accesses the UVM core service as well. The users can bring these variables back and initialize them again. So they're global variables, so you can just put them in your own global space, but that would of course reintroduce the bug. We've since been working a bit more on this one, and we think that we can bring back the UVM top and probably UVM factory variables themselves and just have a minor change in how you'd have to get them initialized. So there's still a bit of work to be done here, and the story's not complete, but we're hoping that this will not be something that much user code has to change for. We changed some transaction handle types from 4-state to 2-state. So there's API in the UVM component, recorder, transaction, and transaction stream. If you're just calling this API, there should again be no change because this is going to be a compatible thing that it will auto cast. But if you did user extensions, you're going to have to change the type in the same way that we did. Again, I would hope that that would be not across all your test bench and test. It would be in a very limited set of files. So I'm hoping that's low impact. We made a few more classes abstract. The register backdoor, some other register callback ones, and the sequence base. We need any user code that is actually instancing this to define a new class and instance that class instead. So you could make a new class directly inheriting from any of these, and then use that new class you just created where you used to be using these directly. And finally, and this is kind of a bigger change here. We did redo the packer, and some of the fields are no longer present, which of course means the functionality of those is not present. So in order to address this one, we are going to provide a compat packer. So it's going to be a new packer class that implements all the behavior that you used to have with the UVM packer. We can't really call it UVM packer because the IEEE is specifying a particular UVM packer. So people will have to change to move over to use this compat packer instead. But again, that should be a very targeted change, not affecting numerous files. All right, so that was the end of all the changes there. You might have some questions about them. So again, at the end of the presentation, we get to Q&A. If you want me to flip back to any of these, no problem at all. One other thing I want to mention with the compatibility is there's a possibility that your code is using undocumented details. So when we went through and determined what we needed to add back, we started with the documented API and we looked at differences there. We really don't know all of the places that people might have used something undocumented, and we might have changed that and not realized it. So we will probably need to get feedback from people of any of these that are common that maybe we can bring back. Some examples, some more complex examples that I've run into is sort of power user stuff where, for example, there's field macros that are supported by the library. I've seen where users have extended that. They've kind of added on to field macros and made their own variations of things that can be specified with field macros. That is going to take a bit of work to make compatible with how the field macros look in the new library. Also, the UVM reg and UVM mem had some functions, some methods here for getting the map, local map and default map. They were never documented, and we did change their signatures in the 1800.2 implementation. And we actually documented one of these in 1800.2 as well. So we can't easily go back. So we'll need a bit of massaging of user code for these if in fact you have been using them. Okay, so all that was backward compatibility. A tangential thing that might be preventing people from moving forward is that they have actually edited the version of UVM that they're using because they wanted to add some functionality to it, and there was no other way to get that functionality other than to edit it. So now if they wanted to move to our later versions, they're going to have to re-edit their changes back into that, and that's a lot of work. So we are noticing some of this and trying to do refactoring that will allow them to avoid editing the library. This won't exactly fix the first time. So with our refactoring here, you'll have to make one more edit to use our refactored code instead of directly changing where you did before. But at least moving forward, it won't be an issue again, because now your edits will be on top of the UVM library, not inside it. All right, so some examples that we've done so far in the resource base, there was some debug API that was essentially not extensible because you couldn't really replace the UVM resource base. Now we're going to have underneath UVM resource base a class called UVM resource debug, which you can replace. So if you want to change any of the debug API behavior, you now have a way to do it. Similar type of thing for the phasing. The phase, the operations of the phase were buried within phasing code, and there was no way for the user to modify that. You couldn't change the global phase handler. Well, now there's going to be this class UVM phase hopper which does allow you to replace it, add, change how the methods work, and you can affect how the whole phasing works if you need to. So we've seen cases of both of these. If there's more cases that come up, we would like to do this refactoring. It's a much better look for the library if we can have things that people might want to customize be more accessible to them. All right, so all of that was trying to reduce the hurdles of migrating. Now, as far as adding motivation, so we continue to fix bugs. Since 1.1D, we've fixed hundreds of bugs. I don't have the exact number here, but trust me, it's going to be hundreds. And just to point that out, even the latest release where we're focusing really on compatibility, and that's what we're trying to address with this, there's still going to be at least 13 more. So far, we've got 13 bug fixes rolled into this, and we might get a few more before we release it. But a big one that I hope people will get excited about is that we're going to be putting in performance improvement for regular expression matching, which has been a big drag on UVM performance, particularly because the config.db, resource DB make heavy use of regular expressions. So we're looking at making that part of the execution be substantially faster, 20–30% faster at least. I can't remember the exact number, and maybe when we get to Q&A, Justin can comment. So where do we stand right now? We have gotten to the point that we have added in the API readditions. So those are in our GitHub version. And it would be great, excuse me, if users could try this out and let us know whether we have succeeded or whether there's still a lot of API that's holding them back, in which case we could try and address that too. Now, the status of this library is that we focused on bringing back this API, not necessarily that we have fully tested it to make sure that it functions the same way. So we're going to keep working on that, certainly. But the current status is it's great for testing compile time compatibility. So compiling this against user code that was good with 1.1D or 1.2 would be a great thing, because we'd point out any holes in what we've added back. Actually running it may work for you, it may not. We're not guaranteeing that yet. We do have a kind of stretch goal to complete this by DAC of this year. So sometime this summer, having this part of the library out, our next effort is going to be to complete these tests and make sure the functionality is all good. Okay, so this leads me to, I think, my last slide, where I have a request for the users who are here. We would like people to download this 2.0. We're calling it an early adopter version. It's available on the Accellera site under the drafts review. And with this tar file, you expand that out, you point your code to use that instead of 1.1 or 1.D and compile it. We'd like to see what kind of compile errors you get. And we're not looking to get any information that has anything to do with your user code. It's just if you see like UVM top not found, point us to that and we'll know, oh, we need to do something because UVM top used to be there and wasn't there anymore. We'll make this sort of a iterative process. So, if you post some errors you see, we'll think about what can be done about that and try and post back patches. And if you still have time, you could apply one of those patches and hopefully get to the next phase or even fully successfully compiling. And if people do get to successfully compiling, we'd sure like to see that, because it would help us know that we are in fact complete in reducing the hurdle that people have been encountering. Okay, so that gets us to the Q&A there. So this is your chance to give any comments or clarify or ask us for clarifications or anything else you want to discuss in terms of this library. So anyone can to unmute and ask.
I have a question.
Sure.
Are there any concerns with incompatibilities between mixing 1.1D, 1.2, and IEEE sequences or any other parts of the libraries in a single bench?
We are hoping the answer is no. So we're trying to bring back this API in a way that they can coexist, so that if you access things in the 1.1D manner or the 1.2 manner or the 800.2 manner, it all works together. If you do access things in the old manner, it may confuse the new style, particularly if people have used the accessor methods in the new style and are counting on that being the only access to these values, because values could change underneath them. And the only fix for that would be using a linter to point out that you've got usage of, or direct usage of, the old API. But as long as that's not a concern for your user code, it should all work together.
Okay, well, Mark, just to be clear, unless I misunderstood the question, you can only use one particular UVM implementation library at a time. You can
That's
use
correct.
the APIs from different ones, but you can't compile 1.1D and 1.2 in the same simulation, right?
No, you cannot do that. You would compile this new library version, but then it should work with user code that was written for 1.1D, or user code that's written for 1.2, and user code that's written for 800.2.
Right.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
There have been quite a few, this is Cliff Cummings, there have been quite a few questions and comments in the chat window. You might open that up and start
that's a
addressing
good
those.
idea. I was not looking at that because I was staring at my own screen. All right, so why don't we go through those then? Let's see. All right, so Cliff is asking, what do we know about vendor support for 800.2? I can't answer that. We could ask some vendors, but I'm sure that the uptake of this from end users will increase the vendor support. You know, if they're seeing that their users are not asking for 800.2, they probably don't do support for it. Any vendors online that want to comment anymore? Okay, well, maybe that's the story then. Bill says, tried to update 2 years ago, hit a reported bug that was a showstopper, so back to 1.2. So hopefully we've fixed that. I hope that you would try again. Tudor says, Java code prints warnings when you're calling stuff marked for deprecation because linters are not that common. So that could be cool too. That would really be on the vendors again. The main thing from the library perspective we want to do is make sure that you're not failing your compile, because you can't move forward. Anything the vendors can do to point this stuff out to you without it disrupting your work is great.
And Mark,
Yeah.
There used to be a compiler directive, like use no deprecated switch, that was in the library code. Has that been removed?
Yeah, we've removed that.
So why?
So we removed that because for backward compatibility, you'd have to set that all the time. And the only usage people get from that is they could turn it off and all of a sudden their compiles wouldn't work anymore. And it was kind of an all or nothing thing. So we just felt like that was contributing to the hurdle of moving to the latest library. You either had to get everything working or you had to keep the deprecated flag on, in which case you're kind of at the point we are right now that we don't use EFF. Does that make sense?
I would actually
UVM no
disagree.
deprecated.
Yeah, I would actually disagree on that, because we have used it to transition, about 100 test benches one at a time. So we're turning it on a bench by bench basis. So it has been useful for evolving our entire organization.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it is useful for migration as long as you're willing to go through the process of winnowing down all the failures so you get to the point that you can actually turn it off. It just seemed like people weren't, as a rule, doing that. And so we went with a softer approach with lint tools supporting this. We can, and once we get this out, we can always hear feedback that it would be helpful to have some way to get compile time warnings or failures that these old API are being used, and we could bring that back. But our initial thing is to try and make sure that users are able to move to the latest library, and then we can decide what to do from there. All right, so Horace said, how about a tool that could auto-translate the 1.2 code to IEEE code? And we considered that, but we just thought it was too difficult. You'd have to be really, a tool like that would have to be really smart about understanding syntax and context and all those kind of things that the working group is just not smart enough to do. Like a tool vendor maybe could come up with such a tool, but the working group, that was kind of beyond us to do that. So Cliff is saying printing warnings would be good. I would agree. Anything that points these out would be fantastic. Okay, talk about the runtime switch. Tutor says, might still want to say old code is fine to use deprecated, but new code should probably not. And I think that's true. I would agree with that. We just need tools or linters to put the output out in a way that you could understand, what was using deprecated stuff and what was not. Okay, so Daniel said a lot of protected variables have caused him grief, particularly some are lacking accessors. I hope we don't have any that are lacking accessors that are useful, but we have certainly unprotected a number of variables that used to be protected in 1.1d and 1.2. I think if there's other ones that you wanted to access, it'd be best to point those out. You could mention them in the forum, and we could look at those on a case-by-case basis. Is the intention to share this slide set? I would like to share it. I think I'll put it on the forum. I don't know exactly what DVCon does, but we'll get up with them as to whether they want this slide set put on their site or not. Access to the slides, yep. Oh, and Lynn said it will be. Okay, so thanks, Lynn. Okay, how about making more stuff interface classes? So that's a good idea. It's a bit more than we could bite off in this release, but once we have kind of the majority of users onto our current release, we could think about doing things like this. Okay, I think Josh kind of said that. What's the practical difference between the most recent vendor supplied UVM library versus the IEEE one? So the main thing with the IEEE initiative was to make the API more coherent and kind of good from a normal software standpoint. So there was really a lot of API that shouldn't have been API by standard software practice that got cleaned up. And everything should just work better and be easier to maintain with IEEE. But the difference, the reason that you'd want to move forward to the IEEE is what we're talking about with the motivation. Like we want to keep adding in these bug fixes and performance improvements. Okay, more on the interface class. Maybe we can discuss that after this. Okay. Gordon says he had to hand edit 1.2 code to fix bugs that had Mantis bug reports, but didn't make it into the IEEE release. So we should get any Mantis bug reports that we had worked on into the IEEE release. Perhaps there are some Mantises that have not had activity on them. And if there's important ones, please highlight those. If, you know, the working group, each time a new version comes out, we kind of look at the bugs that are open, and the members of the working group say, hey, these look like ones we should probably work on. And that's how things get done. If there's ones that are important to somebody who's not got a representative there, it's kind of hard to know about it. So, so please do bring those up. You know, we do take information from the forum into our working group discussions, and that could be a good way to get in there. Refactoring. Oh, Tudor says refactoring is the process of systematically improving your code without writing new functionality. That's true. So there should not be new functionality there, but we should make it available to be used in a better way.
My point is, don't call it refactoring.
Well, what would you like it to be called?
No, in the sense that don't avoid this. Like we use the word has a definition, and you use it to mean something else. So this is what I meant with that post.
Okay.
Call it code changes, call it improvements, call it something else, but refactoring means something.
So we took, so what it really means is we took functionality out of one class and we put it in another class. If there's another term for that, I'd be happy to use it.
Restructuring, I don't know.
Yeah, restructuring, that's good. Okay, do all simulators support interface classes? We really need the simulators vendors to talk about that. Okay, more about interface classes. That one. Okay, one about an auto UVM test bench generation. Not sure I can answer that one right off reading it. Did you cache compiled regular expression objects in the config DB? Justin, are you on the call? Okay, Justin worked on this, so I don't have the answer for you for that. Is the DVM committee working on any alternate paradigms to TLM transaction? Not currently. So we are currently full-time working on how to get a release that people can migrate to. After that is done, we will certainly be entertaining other things we could, other bigger things we could tackle, but not currently. So when we get around to you know, the end of this year, it'd be good to bring up thoughts like this so we can discuss them as to what to do next. Vendors have qualified the various releases on their platforms. Yeah, there was the no deprecated flag. are we going to provide more examples in the user guide for the new release? Okay, so we don't actually have a user guide. We do have release notes. And I assume that you're talking about examples of what people might have to do to change their code if they used to run with 1.1 or 1.2. So we do hope to do that. Tudor points out that with a linter, you can get warnings just piling up and nobody pays any attention to them. That's certainly the case. So we'll look at other ways, but again, the key thing here seems to be that some people just need to be able to continue to simulate. So we don't want to stop them, but we do want to point out these things, and we really need to let the vendors and tool providers work out how best to do that. So Jonathan said maybe a meet could look at part of that. And I think that's probably true, but I can't really speak for what any vendor is going to do. But along those lines would be what we're thinking about.
I disagree with this point with the vendors and whatever have to handle this deprecation thing. This could be possible to just say in this hierarchy between under this component, these things are not allowed. You can't build this kind of thing in the library, yeah? Maybe not now, but eventually, yeah? That you just say this is new code.
Yeah, you're thinking based on some kind of if-def?
Not necessarily if-def, it can also be dynamic. So if you just set some kind of switch somewhere, you know, like where you say in this hierarchy, I do not want to have, or I can imagine, so other languages do it like this. Yeah, that's at runtime, you get the information, not at compile time, that you're doing some stuff that's deprecated, or, and that you can still say, but don't annoy me with this because I know it's deprecated, but I still have a good reason of using it.
Okay. So if somebody uses a variable that we really wanted to protect and have accessors, but we're not protecting it because that's incompatible.
Yeah, that might be tricky. Yeah. So
yeah, I don't know how we do that.
Yeah, for variables it might be tricky, but like for other things like functions and stuff, there you could build in some kind of things.
Yeah, for functions we could do it, and I think for the next go round, that's a good idea. Like to think about things like that we could do.
I wanted to add that I think the UVM went through a stage when going between 1.1D and 1.2 and then IEEE, where there was a lot of deprecation going on. I don't think that's going to happen, or at least I hope the UVM committee has realized the pain in introducing deprecated features. So I would like if they just make a clean break and saying from this point on, we're not going to we're not going to deprecate anything unless there's a very high bar that's passed. And we do this with System Verilog. We say we're not going to deprecate anything unless it's not working. And I think if UVM has reached the point where they've gotten to, well, we've got everything working and we're not going to be deprecating anymore, then having a UVM no deprecated becomes a very stable line that has to be crossed. Does that make sense?
I think that makes sense. We just got the feeling that we weren't anywhere near being able to cross that line, that there wasn't going to be enough user code out there that could run without the use deprecated flag.
Well, people are picking up the latest version all the time that, and they're going with it. And so those people we'd like them to be able to be more strict about how they use the UVM. And if you don't have the no deprecated, you're never going to get clean IEEE UVM code.
Hey, can I point out, Mark, there is no use deprecated flag. There is no deprecated flag. So you have to explicitly activate to say, I want just the new stuff.
Right.
So it doesn't pain you. It pains you to say, I just want the new stuff. And this is what Dave's trying to explain. So you have to explicitly activate that you want just the new stuff. You're thinking that you have to somehow activate that you want the old stuff, but that's not what that switch does.
Well, that wasn't the way it worked in 1.2. But in 800.2, we changed it to a use or include deprecated or something like that. So it's positive. But anyway, it's you can do it either way. Exactly the usage of the flag is not as important as whether it's a flag that people can make use of. And it seems like if people aren't migrating, then they're essentially saying we can't do without the deprecated stuff. And that's why we're bringing it back. If people get to the point they say, hey, we are working now and we'd like to chase down getting rid of any of our usage of API, we could entertain other ways to do it, whether it's runtime or bringing back ifdefs or whatever. I just would like to at first get the baseline that most people are on the latest version, and then we can think about that.
Yeah, and we weren't arguing this, so we understood this that this is what you want. So it's just that Dave was trying to argue that you do want to provide like paths also to enforce that you're using the latest.
Yeah, and I get it.
And you want this as well, yeah. So we all want the same thing. It's not.
Yeah. So I would say that the path forward is get onto the upcoming version that you can do with a low hurdle, and then we worry about how to more enforce the people or enable enforcement for the people that would like to get onto just using the latest API. Okay. We had a question from Dave and then a follow-up from Daniel about the documentation. So Dave's comment says 1.2 had the online HTML documentation that we don't have in IEEE, and that's a barrier to migration. So the problem that we have there is that the standard is really the IEEE, and if we copy information from the standard into our code, we're potentially getting it wrong or getting it stale or whatever. It's like we're making our own standard, and we can't do that. Like the standard has to be IEEE. So we made a point to not put out documentation that repeats what's in the IEEE. I agree it's nicer to have HTML options and not just the PDF that's in the IEEE, but I don't know what to do about that. And then Daniel says he likes the UVM documentation generation tool and wanted to know if it could be extracted. So it's just, I can't remember what tool we actually use, but I don't think it's anything that we would distribute. I think it's just something you can get. I cannot remember the name of it. We'll try and, if you post it again on the forum, I'll try and look it up and let you know. Natural docs. Okay. Thanks, Chris. And Mark says natural docs too. So yeah, so natural docs should be something that you can use. Like that's not something that the UVM committee developed or anything like that. It's just a tool you can Google and find natural docs. Okay, can we get the IEEE to publish an official HTML version? Perhaps. I don't know that they do that kind of thing for other standards. So that could be a roadblock. We can certainly bring it up with the IEEE.
Yeah, actually they don't, because the IEEE owns the copyright to the documents and they distribute them and control who can get them. So most of us can get it through corporate agreements with the IEEE, but the idea that they would put something out on the web for anybody to get is pretty unlikely.
Oh yeah, that's not going to happen then. Yeah. So unfortunately, no, we're stuck with IEEE PDFs. So I skipped over Tutor's comment. There's no more IDE support with IEEE in form of tooltips or class function docs. That could be true. Yeah, I need to ask somebody from Amica or somebody else that does IDEs, but I could see your point.
So is the text copyrighted and you just can't paste it in the library to tie it off to the other point? So if you have a class description in the PDF, you would not be allowed to just put it in the library because the IEEE owns the copyright to that.
Yeah.
That kind of sucks, right? So there's no more like IDE support in the sense that I see what the function does, what the.
Yeah, it's a good point. Let me, I could do some more research on it.
Let me chime in there too. I live and die by those tooltips in the IDE.
Okay, good point.
Actually, I suppose if it's just a description of what the class or method does, just extracting that little bit could be considered fair use. The question originally was taking the entire documentation and turning it into HTML, where you have everything, including the arguments and all the other stuff. That would be too much, I think. But for each individual piece, having a brief description could probably be considered fair use. But I'm not a lawyer, so.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I couldn't really say whether that could be done, but it seems like if we discuss this with IEEE, we could maybe come up with something that's still useful for everybody.
I mean, like if descriptions of fields and whatever what they mean is not in there, then it's kind of like also lacking, yeah, tooltip wise and IDE support wise.
Right. No, a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Not to sound ignorant, but what is it more than just the class description and function description, the PDF? It is basically just that, right? It describes the classes and the methods and what they should do. It's not user guide or anything. The last time I read it was a while back, so like the IEEE document. This is why I ask.
I don't know where you would draw the line there. I mean, certainly there's some classes and methods within the class where there's a big paragraph describing what it does. Presumably for a tooltip, you might like, or you might get by with less information. You might just want a sentence highlight of what it does and more of an overview. So that could be different, but I think we need to just look into this. So Horace asked why we moved to IEEE in the first place. Wasn't Accellera good enough? So I don't know that I have all of the background on this, but I think part of it was that across the world, IEEE is seen as the standards board, and Accellera really doesn't rise to that level. And so we wanted to get an IEEE standard just to be more of a first-class standard. I don't know,
Also,
Tom?
Verilog is an IEEE standard, so.
Yes.
So Mark, I'm going to put my steering committee member hat on and say that it's 5 o'clock. We
Yep.
have sponsored sessions available, as well as general networking in the gather.town. So time to wrap it up here.
Yep. So we can wrap it up. I do appreciate the questions here. We've had some good points raised, some things I'll look into further. Please do look at the forum for more discussion on this. Please, if you can, download the library and test it out and give us more feedback on how we're doing. And appreciate you attending, and hopefully at the next Birds of a Feather, we can all gather around and just say what a good job we did. All right, well, thanks everyone.